Hi again, everyone. My name is Asher Cohen. I'm here for Ajam Media Collective, and I'm here with Mishana Garschi and Sohail Daulatzai talking about the last two chapters and the conclusion of Sohail's book, Black Star, Crescent Moon. Um, the chapters we're going to discuss today are about Muhammad Ali and the Carceral International, but we're going to start off with just some questions about Ali. For American audience, I'd say he's iconic. He is an American hero at this point, which was probably not a trajectory he expected to be back when he started boxing. But my first question for you, is there a modern day Ali in American sports? And if not, do you think there's room for one, or do you think that Ali is very specific to a certain point in time?
That's a good question, Asher. I mean, I think whether there's another Ali, again, it's like what made Ali so amazing was like not only was he kind of produced by the kind of historical moment that he was in, but he also produced a historical moment. You know what I mean? Like he kind of furthered it. I mean, I talk about in my book a little bit like Ali's really not given credit for. I mean, when people talk about the '60s in more like affirming tones, as opposed to kind of this apocalyptic tone that, oh my God, like black people are taking over. But in more affirming tones, like, oh, like the white hippies went on college campuses and they protested and, they're just, they really expressed themselves and blah, blah. The whole anti-war movement that's kind of in some ways seen as like quintessentially American in terms of how it's been appropriated. But what's not understood with that is how central Ali was to creating that, right? I mean, remember when he gets stripped from his title, the only way that he can really make money is to start touring colleges and universities and doing speeches. And it's Ali's tour of colleges and universities that really galvanizes the anti-war movement on college campuses. So, Ali, like I said, was a product of his time in that, of course, Malcolm in many ways is kind of like an older brother to him. And what he sees coming out of the influence of Malcolm and the Nation of Islam at that time with civil rights and desegregation happening, Ali is a kind of product of that. But at the same time, as I'm saying, Ali produced the moment himself. So that when we think about today and like who's the new Ali, I mean, you have these little sparks or like flare-ups of athletes maybe doing something here or there, whether it was in the mid-'90s with Mahmoud Abdul Rauf, who refused to stand for the national anthem when he was with the Denver Nuggets, all-star point guard. You even had like an incident earlier this year with Dion Waiters, who had recently converted to Islam. He's a basketball player. He was on the Cleveland Cavaliers, and now he's on the Oklahoma City Thunder, where he wasn't standing for the national anthem, or so the rumor went. And then, of course, it got kind of quashed by his agent and his manager, and they just kind of like cooled it out. So you have these kind of momentary flare-ups of athletes speaking out, over the last few years. There was a player, Howard, from the Dallas Mavericks a few years ago, who was caught on someone's phone video saying that he doesn't stand for the national anthem, blah, blah, blah. So, and then, of course, kind of basically slowed down his career. But I don't think like it's about the athlete so much as it is the times. And I think I have to go back to like the fact that we don't have an athlete like Muhammad Ali today says more about the times than it does about professional athletes. I mean, I think we have to remember, like, imagine like LeBron James, like refusing if there was a draft, but forget the draft. Imagine LeBron James coming out right now and saying, you know what, America is a racist, imperialist country, right? Like its wars abroad are completely unjust, right? Its treatment of black people and the prison industrial complex is racist, and that's my position, right? Like, I think it's almost unfathomable for people today to think about that. But again, that's because the times don't demand it. You know what I mean? Are we going to get to that point? Maybe. I don't know.
Yeah.
What do you think about the? I agree with you that it's a matter of the times. But what do you think about the athletes who have taken a stance against Ferguson and like the domino effect that that created? Wearing the Black Lives Matter shirts and then like the St. Louis Rams coming out with their hands up.
No, absolutely. And again, those are instances. So Black Lives Matter, and I was going to get to that. So thanks for the question, Mishana. I mean, I think Black Lives Matter stuff like is what's kind of galvanizing kind of social movement energy right now, justifiably so. And you had, like you mentioned, Mishana, with the St. Louis Rams. The teams wearing the T-shirts in the NBA at least during warm-ups. I thought, an interesting moment was last year after Donald Sterling was caught saying what he said, during the NBA playoffs. And I say caught because probably every other owner in the league except Michael Jordan, and maybe, I don't even know what Jordan really thinks, but every other owner in the league actually does and says and at least thinks the same exact stuff. Sterling just got caught, right? He was just stupid enough to actually say it. But I remember last year when the Warriors and the Clippers were playing, and it was at such a kind of fever pitch, the kind of tension in the league, that there was rumors that they weren't going to play the game, right? There was rumors that they were going to take the court, and the game was about to start, and then there was going to be the jump ball to open up the game, and nobody was going to jump. Both teams were just going to kind of walk away. And I just almost imagine, I kind of hunger for like a moment like that in the kind of theater that would have been had an NBA playoff game started and the ball goes in the air and the players just walk away. Like, what would the advertisers have done? What would the commentators have done? What would the league have done? But apparently that was, from what you hear talking to different people, that was the threat the players made to the NBA, that unless you do something about this issue, we're not going to play any playoff games. So, I mean, I think you see these kinds of moves made, and while I really appreciate the kind of position that many athletes took, whether it was David West's tweets or the Black Lives Matter T-shirts or the hands up stuff with the St. Louis Rams, I think, what we're starting to see is the beginning of a kind of space where athletes who I believe have a political sensibility, but again, the times don't provide a space for them to necessarily express them. You know what I mean? They don't necessarily have. So the St. Louis Rams, when those players came out and did what they did, right? The St. Louis Rams couldn't just immediately sanction them, right? They had to contend with public pressure that had they sanctioned them, there would have been pushback, right? So I think that like we're seeing the beginning of a space where athletes are able to express themselves. But I think you see, and I'm not here to compare what the Black Lives Matter people do to this, or even Ali to this example I'm about to give, but the politicization of the black athlete, there's a high level of awareness already on their part. I mean, look at the way Marshawn Lynch refuses to answer a question. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, that is not like a stand that Ali took. I don't think we can necessarily put them on the same level, but it's essentially a big fuck you to mainstream sports. It's like, I'm not going to deal with this spectacle of you coming to ask me questions, right? And, you heard him say, shout out to my real Africans out there, right? I mean, so I think, you have these examples and moments happening, but I still go back to the fact that while there is increasing space within the culture for athletes to voice these kinds of concerns, it's not at the point that it was in a previous era when Ali was around. Let's keep our fingers crossed that it will.
Yeah. So I guess I have a question between the relation, and you kind of already discussed it, but the relationship between Ollie and Malcolm. Do you think that Ollie was like carrying the legacy of Malcolm, and how do the two individuals compare or conflict? And a step beyond that, like how does engaging sports like change the discussion, and as a result demand a larger audience?
I mean, that's a great. I mean, the relationship between Ali and Malcolm is a very kind of convex one. I mean, Ali has written since that the biggest regret of his life was turning his back on Malcolm. And again, for those of us who don't know, obviously with the splits within the nation, when Malcolm was essentially responsible for bringing Ali into the Nation of Islam, and Ali kind of saw him as an older brother figure. Malcolm was in his late 30s at the time, and Ali was in his early 20s. So you had like a huge age gap, but kind of a mentor-mentee, big brother, little brother kind of relationship. And when Malcolm's splits with the nation became more kind of obvious and more kind of, for lack of a better word, you know, visceral, if you will, Ali was forced to choose. And the nation basically put pressure on Ali to side with the nation and to break away from Malcolm. And Ali, like I said, regrets that decision. He said it's the biggest regret of his life. Now, the nation saw Ali as someone who could continue to carry the torch and give the nation the kind of visibility that a figure like Malcolm did. In fact, and to your question, Mishana, potentially maybe even a bigger stage, right? So Ali was the heavyweight champion of the world. I mean, remember, the day after he wins the heavyweight championship against Sonny Liston, he announces his conversion and his name change, right? And so the nation essentially puts their eggs in the basket of Ali. And sports for them, while the nation has a very kind of, I wouldn't even say conflicted, they have a very straightforward position on sports. They see sports as a tool to kind of depoliticize black men, right? And depoliticize black people in general. The sports they see as a tool or vehicle for white control and white domination. Yet with a figure like Ali, they somehow made an exception to that, and for understandable reasons. So I think that history between Ali and Malcolm is a very vexed one, but, you know, Ali regrets it. The nation saw Ali as this person who could continue to carry the torch, a la Malcolm, but I think Ali's banishment from boxing, but yet his ability to kind of galvanize kind of black youth went a long way toward giving the Nation of Islam more credibility maybe than it would have had otherwise. But we have to remember that just as Ali joins the nation, you see the rise of the Black Panther Party and Black Power, and that becomes in many ways the primary vehicle that harnesses young black energy in the late 60s. The nation starts to diminish a little bit, you know, and they don't have the same kind of traction that they did necessarily when it came to the period in the early to mid 60s with Malcolm X.
Awesome. I have a question that brings Ali into the Muslim International. You have in your book this really great moment when Muhammad Ali goes to Pakistan, and he's giving talks and doing things there, and he says, I'll always have a home in Pakistan. I guess my question was, and then I know this is a little bit outside your area of focus in your research, but Ali's a black convert to Islam. Would he really always have a home in Pakistan? Do you think that like Islamic republics view black Muslims, American Muslims, as allies necessarily, or only if they're celebrities, or even if they're celebrities, they wouldn't accept them? What do you think would be the relationship if that was more than just a thing that Ali said?
Right. No, I think that, and that's an excellent question. I mean, I think what Ali's claim. I mean, I think we have to understand it from two sides. You know, your point, obviously, and I'll get to that in a second. But obviously, Ali's position on this, right, and the Nation of Islam's position on it, vis-a-vis their relationship to the larger, you know, for lack of a better word, Muslim world, and that's a problematic term, but we'll just say Muslim world. They sought to gain legitimacy by constantly connecting themselves to that, and you see it in the rhetoric and the language of the Nation of Islam, but you saw it in the actual overtures that were made. I talk about in my book early on the kind of meetings that Malcolm organized between leaders in Sudan, in Egypt, you know, in Tanzania, leaders of those countries, in New York City, right? So the Nation of Islam was kind of always invested in its relationship to the Muslim world, right? And so when Ali wins the title, you know, the nation organizes this tour of Ali. And, you know, one of them is on the website of Ali, kind of, I think it's Ali maybe getting off the plane. No, you guys have the Allah is the Greatest one up, I think. But there's another newspaper that I had up in the exhibit, Return of the Mecca, where Ali's stepping off a plane in Cairo, right? And it says, Cairo welcomes Muhammad Ali. And so the nation organized this kind of trip of Ali to Ghana, to Egypt, to Pakistan, to a whole host of other countries, again, to solidify those relationships, because they wanted that legitimacy. They wanted that, and not just legitimacy, it was politically strategic for them to make those alliances, because in terms of the moves that, at least during the time of Malcolm, they were trying to make, they sought to kind of have the support of governments or states or entities, in the Muslim world to kind of speak on behalf of the struggles of black people in the United States. Now, your question, Asher, what was that really about? Like, what did it mean for Egypt or Pakistan or Iran? Like, Iran releases a stamp in 1983 of Malcolm X, right? What does it mean for these countries to kind of celebrate these figures? Now, I think there's several things going on. One, obviously, is because of the place of black people in the United States, many of these countries, when they want to stick a finger in the eye of the American government, it's always very convenient for them to point out the U.S.'s treatment of black people, right? So why not point out human rights? America is really hell-bent on pointing out human rights violations of other countries. Well, here's an opportunity now for these countries to say, hey, America, what about your human rights violations of black people? In fact, we're going to celebrate somebody who you consider like the evil, Malcolm X. We're going to put him on a stamp, right? So there's that kind of strategic move that those countries made. But secondly, and I think more importantly, is I don't think it's really about necessarily black Muslims in the United States that raises this question. I think it has to do with what some have called colorism or the internalization of white supremacy within countries of the Muslim world, that you see that darker-skinned peoples in Pakistan, in Iran, in Iraq, in Egypt, wherever you go, are treated differently, if not, and I should say worse than, lighter-skinned countrymen or countrywomen, right? So I think that issue still raises, is an issue that needs to be dealt with in those countries, that there is this kind of way in which the internalization of white supremacy still sees blackness as the lowest rung on the totem pole. But it's, again, just like it is here in this country, it's very convenient for people to prop up a particular black person to say, I'm down with black people. But that doesn't necessarily mean you're down with black struggles. And is that what's happening in those countries? Possibly. But I don't think we can completely dismiss it, because when you look at the moves that Malcolm was making, and you look at the ways in which other black activists and black radicals were connecting themselves with the struggles in those countries and vice versa, you did see mutuality there. But I do think there are some tensions that are still unresolved.
So before we move on to the next chapter, I wanted to ask about the last few decades of Ali's silence. And do you think like a change has occurred in his relationship with the Muslim International?
Do I think a change occurred in terms of his relationship with the Muslim International?
Yeah, so since his relationship with the U.S. is being viewed as in a more benevolent and positive light, how do you think Muslims are viewing him as this is occurring? Or maybe nothing is happening and I'm just reading.
No, you're not. And I think that was the kind of main argument of that chapter, was that when you look at, the 50s, the 60s, and then the rise of hip-hop in the 70s and 80s, you see a continuing presence of black Islam as this kind of radical voice challenging kind of, white supremacy, U.S. state power. And of course, as we talked about last week, Malcolm X continued to be kind of resurrected and brought back, all the way up until the early 90s with Spike's film. So you saw the kind of, deep presence of a figure like Malcolm and Farrakhan within, black youth culture and black politics. And so to me, that was something that the state in many ways sought to manage, if not contain or undermine. And that's why I argued that Ali became this figure that they could appropriate and make an American hero. So as opposed to the way in which Malcolm and Farrakhan were talking about the United States government and its atrocities, here you now have the U.S. government embracing at the highest levels of state power, of course, the Medal of Honor, the Medals of Freedom, but obviously also in popular culture, Ali's completely celebrated, right? Athlete of the century, he's lighting the Olympic torch, all this stuff that I went through in the book, to say that I think, look, you can be black, you can be Muslim, and you can love America. right? And ironically, Ali, the very thing that gave him the power and the position that he had, his ability to speak, his tongue, right, was something that he didn't have in the 90s. So Ali became this, as I argue, this kind of symbol, this metonym, this metaphor for thinking about how the U.S. co-opted and sought to undermine the Muslim International. So I would agree with you, Mishana, that prior to the 96 Olympics, in fact, right, Ali, I think, was, to a certain extent, I mean, it's difficult. I mean, Ali in the 80s, we have to remember, supported Ronald Reagan, right? Ali endorses Ronald Reagan for president. So it's complicated when you talk about Ali in the 80s, his career away from boxing. But if we think about Ali's legacy in the 60s and 70s, it's very much a part of the Muslim International. In the 80s, Ali kind of disappears. When he comes out to deal with the Iran hostage crisis. He comes out to kind of travel to Muslim countries to deal with some of the tensions back and forth between the Muslim world, so to speak, and the United States. Of course, we see this again after 9/11, where Ali becomes this kind of peacekeeper type figure, right? So Ali kind of, right around from the 80s on, had a slightly different kind of profile when it came to his relationship to the United States. But I think by the 90s, when he's completely embraced as the quote-unquote American hero, I think it does incredible work for the United States to rewrite the legacy of the 60s, and also what I think is continuing to happen today, to divorce black people from their relationship to Islam. I think that's ultimately what it is. And not just divorce it from its relationship to Islam, divorce black people and their relationship to an Islam that is critical of U.S. imperialism and white supremacy. I think that's what they're trying to fracture with the embrace of Ali.
Cool. Yeah, I want to kind of use a question, to move from Ali to the 5th chapter, which is a bit more about prison industrial complex, things like that. But when we talk about conversion, and it's something that we didn't get to talk much in the book, and being like not just Ali's conversion into Islam, but also you talk about Black Americans converting to Islam, especially in the prison context. How is the conversion process different for Black Americans, and for, especially if we're talking in the prison context, different from kind of like going to the mosque and talking to the imam sort of thing? I guess like is there a difference in conversion if you're Black and taking on a additional identity versus, I guess, what is the identity forming process in that conversion?
Within a prison, you're talking about, within a prison context.
I think, yeah, the prison specifically, I think is something that's super interesting, something that's kind of glanced on a bit in the 5th chapter.
Right. No, I mean, I think it's a very good question, Asher. I mean, I think, like, for me, what kind of structured my thinking on this last chapter, and it was really interesting because my editor, shout out to Richard Morrison, an incredible editor, but he was like, "Hey, Sohail, your book ends on such a down note. It's so pessimistic. Like, it ends on the prison. Like," and I'm like, "Richard, there's like no happy endings here. You know what I mean? Like, it's just not going to come out like that. Like, this is not a fairy tale movie." And I was joking with him, of course. He didn't expect that to be, but he was like, "It's such a kind of, there's this kind of pessimistic tone to it." But I think that's kind of where I was, but it's also where and how I was seeing things unfold, because what I was looking at was essentially, as we've been talking about, Malcolm X is what structures the book, right? And he becomes this figure that I think continues to structure U.S. politics, right? And so even, especially when it comes to the prison, right? Like, so that's why I wanted to finish on a chapter on the prison, because, and of course the epilogue, which hopefully we'll talk about, I bring Malcolm back in terms of his relevance today. But I think what I was trying to get at with the prison chapter was like, look, what does the prison mean for Black people, particularly in this moment where, as we now, with Michelle Alexander's book and the new Jim Crow and a whole host of other, Ruthie Gilmore and a whole host of other people who've done kind of work on not only just the prison abolition, but just kind of the centrality of the prison within Black life. Like, what does it mean now for, one out of every 4 prisoners in the world are African American, 1 out of every 4 prisoners in the world are African American, right? That means they're in the United States. They're black people in the United States. And what does that mean? And I think when you think about the United States, especially post 9/11, right, there was a tremendous amount of hysteria and fear over, as I argue in the book, the emergence of another Malcolm X within the prison context, right? So there was a tremendous amount of policing of black inmates in the prison and their conversion to Islam. And if they did convert to Islam, because there's a deep tradition of that happening in prisons, like, how do we police it so that we don't allow the emergence of another Malcolm? And you've seen this happen and with the kind of vetting of the kind of prison religious figures that they allow in. So now all the materials are looked at. All the different imams that are that go into prisons are completely vetted for their politics, the kinds of words the ideas that they have, anything that they've written, what they say in khutbahs or in organizing spaces. So there's a way that there's a real strong attempt to de-radicalize black prisoners, black Muslims in prison, right? So I think it's important to understand that framework when thinking about like the prison in particular. Now, as to your question about conversion, Asher, I think there's different reasons. I mean, prison becomes, and when you read kind of, and I've talked to several people, like their experiences, like it's a range of different things. For some, it's it's deeply influenced by Malcolm. Malcolm came out of the prison. What was that about? Prison was a time where now it's about reading and self-transformation, and Islam was this vehicle that helped Malcolm. Knowledge of self, I'm going to go through that process myself. For others, it might be something as simple as, safety or security, right? I mean, I'm not trying to minimize it, but, with all that goes on in prisons in terms of especially the racial groupings of the blacks, the Latinos, the whites, the Muslims kind of have this they're kind of like this safe space, so to speak, where you just don't mess with the Muslims kind of thing, right? And I remember the Richard Pryor joke about super Muslims. For those of you who don't know, like, he would talk about going to visit a prison, and he's like, there's not Muslims in there, there's super Muslims, right? But so I think there's also just that everyday need for protection, but more often than not, it's about within the prison, the conversion is about that knowledge of self, and it's about the kind of disciplining process that they feel that the religion gives them in this place called the prison. It gives them that kind of order and ability and possibility for self-transformation. But like I said, that's all happening within a crucible in which, the Bureau of Prisons are hell-bent on shaping and disciplining and policing a particular kind of Islam coming out of the prison.
Awesome. It leads in great with the question that we had from Samiha Rahman, who reviewed the chapter for us, and wrote a really good question that I'm going to try and do service to. But she asked that, given the rich history of Islam in U.S. prisons, which she just explained, and also with Malcolm X and how he came from a prison context, and how Bureau of Prisons now is trying to really constrain that as much as possible, what does this mean for Muslim chaplains or for volunteers who, if they believe in the radical message of Malcolm X or similar messages, or they just want to make space for those sorts of beliefs within a prison context, how do they deal with these constraints? How would a volunteer, how would Muslim chaplain, how would they deal with this in the present day? Is there a way to get any sort of happy ending out of that 5th chapter?
Well, I mean, I think I don't know. I mean, it's a very, we have to understand, and obviously, hopefully many of us know that when we talk about prisons, we're obviously talking about a highly controlled, highly routinized, highly surveilled space. I mean, that's why it's called a prison, right? So I think that, and I talked about in that chapter, how at the time, Attorney General Alberto Gonzalez and a whole host of other congressional leaders, civic leaders, etc., were testifying in front of Congress about the fear. They saw black inmates in particular, black Muslims, as this 5th column of subversion, right? That, Gonzalez makes the point, right, as well as Charles Colson and others, that And it's a really interesting like way they talk about how black Muslims essentially can pass as Americans, right? Like all of a sudden the black person can now pass as an American when they're Muslim, right? Because they don't look like the immigrant Muslim. So in fact, they're more dangerous and subversive because they could just look like every other black person who just can be an American. It was just a really interesting way that somehow national passing was this way of thinking about blackness as opposed to racial passing of a previous era, right? But they were so hell-bent on, and the fear of black Muslims that, you know, they decided to impose this whole rigorous program of vetting of these chaplains. And I would say that in this context, Asher, it's very difficult, you know, to get any of this kind of radical literature in the prison. You know, and again, what do we mean by radical? I mean, you know, so this is a question, right? And obviously, I centered the chapter on Imam Jamil, right? Jamil Al-Amin, formerly H. Rap Brown. Now, the reason why, you know, and a lot can be said about his case in terms of the original conviction, the fact that there was a person who admitted to doing it, who wasn't allowed to testify, a whole host of problems. But whatever, say it, be that as it may, he was transferred from a Georgia prison, again, where he supposedly committed that crime, right? And he was transferred to the federal Supermax prison in Florence, Colorado. 60 Minutes talks about it, and I wrote about how they called it the domestic Guantanamo. It's where the kind of more highest prized inmates in the country are held, the high security threats. Why was Imam Jamil moved from a Georgia state prison, where even by their rules and laws, he committed a crime in Georgia? Why was he moved to a federal facility? What was that about? Now, when you look into it, you come to find out that based on his presence within Muslim communities throughout the country. I mean, Imam Jamil, before he was arrested and incarcerated, was the leader of over 34 Muslim communities throughout the country, right? He was a kind of he was a towering figure within the history of within the Black Muslim movement in this country, right? Carrying that torch of Malcolm in many ways. And in the prison, Imam Jamil was having a tremendous amount of influence, not just in the Georgia prison, because if we don't know, within the prison circuit, word travels fast, not just within one particular prison, but throughout the networks of prisons. So the fact that Imam Jamil was incarcerated was mobilizing a tremendous amount of prisoners throughout the country, right? And they felt that this was dangerous. And so they had to isolate him and put him in the federal Supermax prison in Florence, Colorado, where he was there for 23 hours a day on solitary confinement and 1 hour a day on his own, right? And they were doing quote-unquote behavior modification on him, which we can only imagine what that is when we look at the CMUs that have been established in the Indiana prisons that are only for Muslims, and we think about it, as I talk about in the chapter, in the context of Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo. What is this thing? What is this relationship of the Muslim to the prison? And so Imam Jamil was isolated from his original prison because of the influence he was having. And so I say all this to say, Asher, to answer your question, that I think in this context, it's very difficult to get across the kind of black radical tradition that Malcolm was a part of within the prison context, particularly as Muslim prisoners. I think it's a very difficult process to do because of the high level of surveillance that's taking place. I mean, you know, think about, for example, how, and this is not a proper analogy, but think about how even in black Muslim mosques today, imagine how highly surveilled those are. Just you go to a mosque, a Jummah on a Friday, and you go listen to a khutbah, what are you going to hear and what aren't you going to hear? Now, everyone knows they're being watched, so they're not going to say certain things, right? Now, I don't have to even tell you about the immigrant mosques. Like, that's just a whole other story. But, so imagine if there's that kind of surveillance and that kind of policing on a mosque space. Can you imagine what it's like within inside of a prison, right? And how difficult it is to get those kinds of ideas in there, right? So, I mean, I think that it's important for us to understand this because this is not something that's just central, and this is where, and again, why my editor thought the book ended on a down note, because in many ways I was looking at the prison as a kind of allegory for the world at large. That when it came to the Muslim International, the world has become a prison, right? And so that's why I was trying to think about the kind of policing that's taking place, where the line between the prison and the world has become a kind of very fluid one when it came to the Muslim International. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, totally. I think Sohail will be thrilled. Thank you.
So you kind of answered my next question without me asking it.
Okay.
So you just made it clear that this is about more than just the prison. Like we're restricted in our speech, and like so on and so forth. So what do you think this means for the moving forward as a community, if like the space that we exist in is a prison?
Right. I mean, I think, and you know, I mean, we can look at this. I mean, I don't want to make this about this necessarily, but ontologically and epistemologically, like, what does it mean to be a Muslim in this context, right? Like, how does one define that within a context that's so kind of constricting, right? And again, I'm not here to equate my life, you know, with that of somebody who's actually in prison in Guantanamo or, you know, in Florence, Colorado. I'm not here to suggest that. But what I'm suggesting is that there's a way in which, you know, the kind of the collapsing, the paralleling of these discourses and ideas and fears around Muslim are working hand in hand. So, I mean, I think it's important to understand, because, you know, this fear of the Muslim that's causing the prison regime to refashion itself, right? Not just to look at how Muslim inmates are acting, but to kind of securitize all inmates, right? That kind of process that's taking place is also taking place outside of the prison, right? Think about the way in which the Muslim has become a vehicle now for NSA wiretapping, right? Has become the justification for wiretapping, the justification for endless war, the justification for all kinds of means of repression, right? Security has become the dominant frame. Think about what the language in a prison is. It's all about security, right? Secure the prison, right? So in the world, securitization has become the dominant narrative, and the face of the Muslim has been the legitimizing discourse for it. It's become the lubricant for doing that. So as I talked about in the book, like, you know, our good friend William Bratton, former police commissioner in New York, comes to LA to be the police chief here. Now he's back in New York again. Of course, he has his own private security firm that does consulting. And of course, those lines are very blurry in terms of his trips to Israel as a private citizen, while he was also chief of police in Los Angeles, right? But he was instrumental in creating this link between local policing and homeland security. Like, homeland security, people think, well, that's a federal issue and that's dealing with terrorists, right? Well, he was like, well, wait a minute. And I talked about in this book, we have a war on terror going on right here in the urban streets of America. And so how do we create this link between local police and Department of Homeland Security? Well, Bratton spent a whole bunch of his political capital and energy and his political leverage to lobby congressional leaders to make the LAPD this kind of hub between DHS and local policing that could become the model for other police departments around the country to do similar kinds of counterterrorism measures. So the fact that we have, for example, now Countering Violent Extremism, the big summit that was held, and one of the three cities, it's Boston, Minneapolis, and LA, not coincidentally, right? The original Muslim mapping program that was happening around in the 2006-07 time period, LA was going to be the incubator for it. However, the LA is going to map where every Muslim lives, who they are, what their psychographics are, what their income levels are, everything. Well, that's essentially what the NYPD did 3 or 4 years later through the NYPD spying scandal, right? Let me just fast forward. You now see, for example, the NYPD has just formed an anti-terror squad, a 300-man paramilitary organization that William Bratton has called the Anti-Terror Squad. to prevent what he said was what happened in Paris and the protests over Eric Garner, right? You have what in Chicago we just found out was what they called a domestic Guantanamo. The Chicago police were running essentially a black site off the books where they were taking people they arrested and torturing them, right? So this confluence between local policing and Department of Homeland Security, I feel, is like happening at an accelerated rate. And it's having a tremendous impact on this kind of social movements that can take place within particular locations. So that we're seeing the increased militarization. I don't want to say like police were never militarized. They've always been militarized. But we're seeing a deepening militarization of local police. And again, it's the face of the Muslim that's giving that its legitimation and its justification. And I think that's a very dangerous precedent in this context. And I think Muslim communities in particular need to be highly aware of how it is that we're being used, right? Like, I mean, look, let's be real about it. The one thing that both the right and the left agree on is their fear of the Muslim. They are in bed. You look at like leftist Marxists to anarchists to right-wing like neocons, and they will tell you those Muslims are scary, right? That's where they find common cause around the Muslim. And now what I'm saying is like as Muslim communities, we need to wake up and smell the sulfur, because if we don't, right, we're being used in a particular way that is very dangerous, not just to ourselves, right, but we're becoming in many ways the scapegoat, right, for repression on non-Muslim black and brown communities as well.
I want to connect a question with a question I had for you back when we talked about Chapter 1. I don't know if you remember that, but talking about migrants and refugees and their relationship with home communities, the relationship. And you just mentioned right now with you're talking about, compare Black Muslim mosques to immigrant mosques and the amount of surveillance there. Something that I kind of feel like we've been talking around, I kind of want to have question exactly is how much is the relation between kind of parole culture, so Michelle Alexander and that whole the goal in a way is to get everyone on parole, it seems sometimes, and migrant visas, especially refugee rules, and how they are, again, almost always on parole in a way, where if they violate the most minute terms, take a job they're not allowed to have, work longer than they're allowed, something like that, they get launched into the carceral space. I don't know if this is something but it was the kind of paroleization of migrant life in America done as an effect of putting entire urban communities on parole worked out great for our control of them. We should do it for migrants as well, or did it kind of come hand in hand? What is the relationship there, do you think, between how migrants are surveilled as much as possible and sometimes more versus how the same thing's done to black communities in the U.S.?
Right. I know. I mean, I think it's an important emerging question. I mean, my colleague and friend Junaid Rana wrote a great book called "Terrifying Muslims" on kind of race and labor and Muslim migration and the kind of patterns of migration and the kind of state surveillance of these bodies. But I mean, here in Los Angeles and Southern California and along the U.S.-Mexico border, I mean, when it comes to the prison regime, right, or the kind of carceral imagination that I was talking about in the book, there has been, in many ways, a fundamental shift. I mean, by all measures, quote unquote, violent crime is declining, right? There's a pushback in a way that there never was to the kind of war on crime, Rockefeller drug law kind of policies, about kind of the kind of length of sentences that black people were given for non-violent drug offenses. And so because of those kinds of pressures, the kind of prison regime has had to kind of recalibrate, right? And in many ways, reinvigorate a new narrative. And what I'm saying is that narrative, in many ways, has shifted to the migrant, right? So you are now seeing the increased incarceration of migrant populations, particularly along the U.S.-Mexico border, so that many of the same corporations and state interests, right, that were deeply invested in the war on crime, so-called, or the war on drugs, so-called, right, are now invested in kind of the immigration debate and the policing and surveilling of migrants. Even under so-called legislation like the DREAM Act that is seeking to be passed and a whole host of other measures. As you mentioned, Asher, there are all kinds of conditions now being placed on migrants, refugees, different statuses that people are given that makes them susceptible to incarceration. And it's ripping apart families, it's destroying lives, right? But it's creating in many ways a different kind of model of incarceration that I didn't necessarily touch on in the book, but we see it clearly happening with Latino migrants, right? We can only imagine what it means for Muslim migrants in the United States, right? And there's, you know, and again, this is a bigger problem. I shouldn't say it's not a bigger problem, but it's tied to this big problem, which is that in many ways, the dominant narrative in the United States that I think almost all of the mainstream Muslim organizations buy into is that Muslims are a middle class to upper middle class professional group of people, when in fact that's just not the case. The amount of working class and even undocumented Muslim migrants that exist in this country would prove that to be a lie. And I think if as a Muslim community, and I'm very skeptical of that term, but if as Muslims or those who are Muslims in solidarity with Muslim communities, if we can start to build into our political imaginations and our conversations and our visions the lives and livelihoods of working class and undocumented Muslim communities, that would radically transform what we think politics is in this country. But instead we don't. We think about a professional class that's all about getting a seat at the table and trying to basically achieve honorary whiteness, but it doesn't attempt to deal with systemic and structural issues, you know?
Definitely.
I'm gonna move on to concluding your beautiful book.
Okay.
So, in your opinion, I concluded that you're trying to look at the history between Islam, Blackness, and the Muslim Third World through arts and politics through a lens of Malcolm. But how would you, in your words, put the main takeaway from your book? Or did I do it perfectly? No.
I mean, that's kind of pretty good right there. You kind of nailed it. I mean, I think it's really that. It was, that there's a deeper history in this country about the influence of Islam and Muslims on both politics and art that many don't think about, right? There's a deeper history about that influence of Islam and Muslims on politics and art, particularly black politics and art, right? I mean, in many ways, black politics is the conscience of America, right? It continues to get replayed as this, vehicle to redeem the American national project. So black politics is central, despite obviously the attacks on it consistently. It continues to be this kind of the conscience of America. And black art, as we know, both in its most avant-garde and experimental forms, all the way to its most popular, is the foundation of American popular culture. I mean, you can't talk about art or popular culture in America without talking about black artists and black creativity. So when you think about the centrality of black politics and black art in American life, what I was trying to convey was, well, wow, what was the influence of Islam and Muslims, both domestically and what I call the Muslim Third World, on black politics and art? If we can understand the significance of that, and not just the quantitative, if we could, impact that had on black politics and art, but the nature of that influence, the rhetoric of that influence, what it was demanding, what it was asking for, in fact, what it was questioning. If we can understand that, then I think that would go a long way toward, I think, furthering a conversation that's already being had, but furthering a conversation about like real social justice, like in the United States and abroad. Right? That's what I think what I was trying to convey in the book.
Awesome. And along that, just who are both what other writers would you recommend? For people like us who want to learn more about your work and what else is going on in that space, and what are kind of I want to take it beyond writers, just who are good people working on projects, if it's rappers, artists, as well as just academics, because I know there's probably 200 academics you could recommend, but I want to just get more of a
Actually,
wide.
actually, there's not too many. There's not 200 academics I could recommend. There's probably 200 academics working on this stuff, but I wouldn't really recommend most of them. There's a few though. But
This is broadcast,
That's fine. I mean, but there is some really good work being done. I'm not gonna lie. I think Suad Abdul Kabir. I really appreciate her work. Junaid Rana, Mariam Kashani. I think there's an emerging group of younger scholars that I think are doing great work, and I think also emerging like graduate students as well who are kind of were shaped by the kind of racial politics of the United States and understand the U.S. in a very different way, right? That I think is important to pay attention to. They understand, as I think our generation did, how racialization and U.S. state power was operating. And so I think from within kind of academic and intellectual spaces, I think Zahir Ali is another person that I failed to mention. And there are many others. I mean, I don't want to sit here and say that there's nobody doing good work. There is a really good group of people who are doing really incredible work, but I think too much of it is caught in kind of either a kind of liberal multicultural model, which I have a big problem with, or it's caught in the kind of old school religious studies way of thinking about Islam that continues to be very Orientalist. And so, and I think this is part of what me and others were trying to do is we're trying to make the shift from Islamic studies to Muslim studies, right? That is to say that we're interested in the lives and livelihoods of Muslims, right? And what that means within the context of capitalism and white supremacy and patriarchy and these kinds of larger questions. So I would say from a scholarly perspective, those are people that I would definitely encourage people to look into. As far as like artists, I mean, there's a whole host of young artists that are doing great work and writing. Many of them hip-hop artists, many of whom we've talked to or talked about. But obviously in the world of film, incredible Palestinian cinema. I mean, they're not necessarily here in the U.S., Palestinian filmmakers that are doing incredible work, Iranian filmmakers that are doing incredible work. So, I mean, I could, maybe if we did set up something on Ajam where I could send out a list of stuff that, I don't know if that was interesting to people or not, of people that I would recommend that others look at, I'd be more than happy to do something like that. But you kind of put me on the spot, Asher. It sounded like I don't know what I'm talking about, but I'm trying to think. But there's a tremendous amount within the realm of kind of arts and cultural production that I think it's important for us to pay attention to, because as I argued in the book, art and cultural production is a really important place to think about and imagine different kinds of things, right? Different kinds of possibilities that the kind of traditional world of politics doesn't allow for. So I think it's important and incumbent upon us to, look at art and even encourage young people to get into the arts as a way of expressing kind of alternative ideas,
Definitely. Yeah, sorry for putting you on the spot, but
That's all right. That's all right.
I did get a message from Beta saying that we will expect a book list. Don't worry, you don't have too much of a due date. Well,
I'll definitely do that. Anything for
but no, it'd be awesome.
Yeah, anything for Beta. You know how much of a taskmaster she is.
But here's a question, and a bit off of that. How are people engaging? Like I know you've done the book tour. You've given talks at universities. You've done online digital stuff like us. Something interesting, like reading your book, like reading stuff from the time period, it kind of went from people like hanging out in the same literal space in the same neighborhoods to now where like you're going on nationwide book tours and you also have an exhibit, but you're also doing digital things. I guess what are the big avenues for engagement that you've seen, with this book, with Return of the Mecca, with your life? Is it solely through the university, or where do you see this going from that perspective?
Yeah, no, I mean it's something that I think not just me, but I'm sure you all. Even as Ajam or as individuals in your work, we're trying to struggle for what those spaces are, and I think what we're finding is that it's all of it, right? I mean, I think that that's the key at this point, and I think that's why I believe, like, when it comes to universities and the academy, in many ways, like, it's a very it's always been 10 to 15 years behind, right? But it's becoming in a very accelerated way much more so, right? So that this old school model of what is considered the university and role of the intellectual, I think, is changing rapidly, and the university is trying to shift to keep up with it. But again, it's like they say, with a big oil rig, those big oil rigs are big ships in the ocean, right? In order for them to do a U-turn, once they decide they want to make a U-turn, in order to complete the U-turn, they have to travel about 5 to 7 miles before they can actually complete the U-turn. So, suggesting that there's a tremendous amount of inertia in these institutions that is almost prohibitive to anything real happening. So, for me, the university is an important space. I'm not there to say that it's not, but it's limited in what it could do. But that doesn't mean that I don't engage it. I engage it on particular terms. I think teaching is incredible, and I love teaching, right? Um, but I think it's incumbent upon me to look for other ways to get ideas out there. I mean, this is a question that I get a lot from a lot of undergrads who are asking about their future, and I say, look, getting a PhD isn't the only way to get ideas out there. I know I'm probably saying something to Mishana that she's probably heard me say a million times, right? Like, getting a PhD isn't the only way to get ideas out in the world, right? You can do all kinds of other things to get ideas out in the world and spur and create conversations. And so I think what I've tried to do is, how do we find a way to kind of maximize or optimize those possibilities? So for me, it's been about the university. It's been about live public events. It's been about trying to publish in somewhat more mainstream spaces, whether it be Al Jazeera or The Nation or something like Counterpunch, to doing digital kind of platforms like what you guys do here at Ajam. But ultimately, to me, Asher and Mishana, like, I'm old school in that way. It does come down to, like, live gathering. Like, I still feel like a certain kind of, I won't say nostalgia, but there's a certain, I think, realness, tangibility to the kind of live gathering that I think, if done right, we can marshal all these different kinds of platforms and technologies we have to get people to come together in particular ways. And I think that's what I try to do, is, like, what's the way to kind of harness and try and get, ideas or actual bodies live and present in a particular place. So
Yeah. No, we'll definitely, once we're gonna start doing live events, we're really excited to have you there, because I know
absolutely,
we
absolutely,
definitely agree.
yeah. I'm a big supporter of you guys, so I would definitely love to be a part of everything.
Goes both ways, man. Yeah. Sorry, I'm cutting off Mishana. Go for it.
So just to conclude and to bring it back to your work and your
Right.
book, so, like, moving forward as a community, how do you think we can apply the legacy of Malcolm today?
Okay, that question. Um, well, I mean, I think it's such a huge question, and what I tried to do was try to get at it a little bit. I mean, I think, you know, what we're seeing now, and what we're seeing now is, in many ways, the replication of the civil rights project, right, by immigrant Muslims. I mean, of course, there's a whole other history to civil rights that it's impossible to even make that comparison in some ways. But I make the comparison to say that, primarily immigrant Muslims are invested in constitutionality and protecting rights, right, and their place within the mainstream, right? And so in that sense, it dovetails in many ways with much of the logic of what the Civil Rights Project was about. And, part of the reason why I wrote the book was to say, well, wait a minute, this thing that we hold up as civil rights, this thing that's so celebrated in this country, as the vehicle toward political mobilization and social movements, right? That we hold up. Let's look at it from a different angle. Let's probe it. Let's turn it upside down. Let's get at some of its limitations. Because when we start to look at the limitations, then we can start to maybe say, you know what, hey, maybe civil rights isn't the way to go. And maybe there's another approach, right? And that's why I tried to do that with the book, to say, look, the Civil Rights Project was deeply invested with American empire. It was deeply connected to it. It found common cause with American empire. And I was asking Muslims today that if you see yourself as using this legacy to further the rights of Muslims, right, then what are you aligning yourself with, right? You're aligning yourself with a project that's murdering not just other Muslims, but that's murdering other non-Muslim black and brown people around the world. And you're doing that to protect your rights? Like, is that really freedom? Or is that just a different kind of, constriction and limitation? And at the same time, what ethically does that mean for you when that's your politics? And I thought that Malcolm was a really interesting figure as a Muslim, as a black person, to be able to talk about, the contradictions in the current kind of, political mobilization for Muslims. That Malcolm spoke against the kind of Cold War orthodoxy or the civil rights orthodoxy, right? He didn't buy into this logic. And Malcolm centered white supremacy as the structuring logic, right? It's not something that Muslims do today. They don't see white supremacy as structuring how it is that they live their lives, right? And so, to me, I think that it's important to understand that history of Malcolm for the current moment, because if we don't, I think then we fall too easily into many of the traps. I mean, and I'll kind of close on this, but too often the response to people like myself or others who have similar opinions like me, who critique the kind of mainstream Muslim orthodoxy, is, well, Sohail, you're just being impractical. That's just not practical, right? Like, why do you continue? Like, that's not getting anything done. We have to actually get things done. We have Muslim leaders here in Southern California who talk about the distinction between the winners and the whiners, right? We're winners, not whiners, right? And of course, he sees himself as a winner, whatever that means. And everybody else is a whiner. But again, you hear this idea that we're somehow these either lofty idealistic academics who have no real, real world application, or we're these fringe activists who are just so radical and we all wear black and, we walk around in the dark of night and we just plan and plot, but we have no real idea of what real politics is about. I mean, this is kind of the way they see us. And it's really kind of belittling and condescending, but that's kind of a separate issue. But they sit there and they say, and my response to them is this: look, if we look at the Civil Rights Project that you see yourself so much a part of, and you see that as the vehicle toward your redemption and your achievement of civil rights, let's look at civil rights. Where are black people today? If you look at almost every measure, whether it be education, income, wealth, right? Health. If you look at almost every measure, black people are either at or below where they were 50 years ago, right? Mm-hmm. So the question has to be asked, did civil rights work? And the answer unequivocally is no. It helped a small group of people, a black intelligentsia kind of make it, a black middle class make it, but what did it mean for the vast majority of black people? It did not work. It failed. And so then the question becomes, okay, why are you pursuing a project that's failing? It's a failed project. Now, to me, that sounds impractical. That's an impractical project, to pursue this civil rights logic. You're the ones who are being impractical, and maybe you need to rethink the kind of politics that you're trying to put forth, because it's not going to work. And I think that's why I wanted to have Malcolm be this kind of figure that could maybe get people to think differently about, Muslims and non-Muslim people of color lives here in the United States.
Awesome. Thank you so much. This has been an incredibly informative, fun experience. I hope you feel the same way. Both of you feel the same way.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thanks, Mishana and Sohail, for hanging out with us for 3 hours, give or take some technical issues over the past few weeks. And I really hope we've seen a lot more of you. And same for everyone who's watching online. Hope you enjoyed it. Let us know what you think we should do next. And yeah, how you think about it. But yeah, I'm Asher from Ajam Media Collective, ajamMC.com, and Mishana Garschi and Sohail Daulatzai have been hanging out with us the past few hours. And yeah, thanks again. I'm just going to head out unless either of you have any closing remarks.
I just want to thank Ajam and Sohail for allowing me to be a part of this. I had a lot of fun.
Likewise, I want to thank you guys. Beta, I was just joking about you being a taskmaster. Asher, Mishana, and everybody who took the time to watch and listen, I really appreciate it, and I just love what you guys are doing, so let's keep building. Thanks again.
You bet. All right. Everyone have a good one.